I'd like to introduce our panel now. Shere Hite likes to be introduced as a cultural historian. That's what Newsweek called her when it named her one of the 25 most influential women in America. Ms. Hite is best known as a researcher of the Hite Report trilogy. That's the Hite Report, a nationwide study of female sexuality, which was a study of 3,000 women ages 14 to 78. The Hite Report on male sexuality, a study of 7,000 men ages 13 to 97. 97. And the Hite Report on Women in Love, to be published this year. Her latest book includes the thoughts of 3,400 women on the validity of love, marriage, being alone, and relationships with those they love. Her works have sold more than 20 million copies around the world. They've been translated into 13 languages and banned in 7 countries. Fortunately, not this one. She has academic degrees from the University of Florida, is working on her doctorate at Columbia. She lives in both New York City and Paris, and her very strong love of classical music led to her marrying 6 months ago an internationally acclaimed German pianist, Fred Horch. Our other panelists, Jim Jacobson is editor of the Birmingham News. He's worked there since being graduated from the University of Alabama in 1959. A native of Mobile, he is a 3-time past president, eat your heart out, Bob Clark, of the Alabama chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, also known as SDX. Rich Oppel is editor of the Charlotte Observer, born in New Jersey, reared in Florida. He's a graduate of the University of South Florida of the Advanced Management Program at the Harvard Graduate School of Business. Formerly worked for the Associated Press, Tampa Tribune, Detroit Free Press, and the Tallahassee Democrat, finally a paper I've heard of. Ms. Hite, let's start with you. I'd just like you to say whatever's on your mind about this subject, react to what Dr. Ruth said, whatever you're thinking about.
She asked about time.
I'll tell you if you run over.
I see. Okay. I hardly know exactly where to begin. I enjoyed Dr. Westheimer's comments. The difference between the point of view that I might have and she might have, and perhaps many others, is that I unabashedly come from a feminist standpoint. And the feminist contribution to sexuality has been enormous. The idea that women would start speaking out, I suppose, began about 10 years ago, a little more. That has had an enormous impact. I'm sure you're all familiar with Our Bodies, Ourselves, and the number of libraries that's been removed from. My work came from the same tradition, and that is asking women what they thought, not how many times they did something so much as how they felt about it, trying to get at how women would like to define sex. Dr. Westheimer said something about in their clinical experience, the idea was that the man came to the woman with an erection and that was the beginning of sex. When you ask women, what do you like about sex, how would you define it? Perhaps you come to something entirely different than traditionally what we've thought of as sex, namely simple penetration. The fact is that my work was the first to show that most women don't have orgasms simply from intercourse itself and needed clitoral stimulation. When that was published in 1976, I certainly didn't expect it to be a bestseller. I thought this would be academic, or it would be also for feminists, but I never expected a big media reaction. I certainly had no experience, nor did anyone in my family have experience with the media or anything to do with bestsellers or anything of that sort. So I was totally unprepared for the kind of reaction that I became immediately embroiled in. On the one hand, I was very insistent in my own mind that this was information that was very important for women, because I had letter after letter saying from women, as my work was anonymous, the replies were all anonymous. Women felt very bad if they didn't have an orgasm during intercourse, and you know, traditionally this has been referred to as a problem for women. Women have a problem, supposedly, having orgasm, but actually we don't have a problem having orgasm. The society has had a problem in how it defines sexuality. So even trying to discuss sexuality with reporters, I found that there was a problem. When you use the word sex, people immediately think of intercourse. Well, men can have orgasm in many different ways besides intercourse. Women generally enjoy intercourse with someone they love, not having anything to do with whether or not they do have orgasm, but generally women need some form of clitoral stimulation. Masters and Johnson said clitoral stimulation was a part of any woman's orgasm, but they felt several years ago, and haven't wanted to take a public position since, that women should get enough indirect clitoral stimulation from simple, as they call it, thrusting. I say, why not call it penile covering? I mean, why is it considered that the woman is stationary and the man is thrusting? In any case, there are many terms like that in the vocabulary, even penetration itself, which show the influence of ideology on how we perceive what we're doing with our bodies. So basically, I think women would like to express love through sex, and yet many women for all too long have had to, after sex with their husband or their lover, go into the bathroom, close the door, and masturbate in order to have an orgasm. That's tragic and ridiculous at the same time. So in 1976, when I had this study, which was the first one that asked this particular question, even Kinsey was he didn't bring this out for some reason or another. He mentioned that masturbation was an easier way for women to have an orgasm, but he didn't define masturbation in detail. My book was the first one in which that was done, and it reveals that some women can only have orgasm with their legs apart, some have to have their legs together, and details like that, which can be very helpful to a young girl or to an older woman who hasn't had an orgasm yet either. Of course, if you can afford it, you can always go to a sex clinic and find this out. You can go to a bookstore and buy a book like mine, which is inexpensive. It's a paperback. But I think the news media really has been extremely helpful to enormous numbers of women. And when Dave Lawrence was the editor of the Charlotte Observer, about, I think it was 1977, he ran in his Sunday edition all the findings of the Hite report. And then he got a lot of letters from the readers, and half were saying how great and half were saying how terrible. How could you do such a thing? The next Sunday, he had a picture of himself on the front page, and then he had a letter to his readers. He thought that this would be a thing that would be helpful to people, but he wanted to hear from his readers what they thought, and he ran all these letters on the front page, pro and con and all of that, and I think that was a wonderful approach and a wonderful way of doing it. The news media can help people all over the world to know more about each other. Many men felt very bad if their penis didn't bring the woman to orgasm, or if the woman had to fake orgasm, she felt very bad. And finding out that the facts are that most women don't get enough clitoral stimulation during intercourse, which is a study which is now verified in 4 other countries. I think it's very helpful. On the other hand, I, like many feminists, really dislike the kind of vulgarization of sex in the media that you see all the time. For example, I hope no one is here from who particularly wrote this story, but yesterday in USA Today, I mean, Dolly Parton, Dolly shapes up at 40. Well, you know, I like Dolly Parton, and I love Dolly Parton's figure, but I mean, the whole focus on women is kind of either a woman is a body or she's a grandmother. You know, Golda Meir, grandmother of 14, you know, had a conference today. Those kind of things, I think, are part of the whole sexuality issue. I think the hook is being drawn here. Thank you.
You recognized it. Thank you. Rich Apple, any thoughts?
Yeah, Bob, I guess I have a short question and then maybe a longer question followed by an observation. The short question, Dr. Ruth, is what's the weirdest question you've ever been asked, and what was your answer to it?
That may be it.
I do not get weird questions. I do get questions, and I'm going to give you 2 of those, who are humorous. I do get questions where I know that a whole dormitory is having a Dr. Ruth party, and then they decide who is going to call, and it's a question asked in jest, but I answer it seriously, because somebody out there might be, and I do the same with newspapers, somebody out there might have had that question. So I have made it a policy. First I giggle, and then I'm going to find something in that question that is serious. Let me give you two examples. One, some of you might have heard. A young man called because it illustrates exactly what I believe in terms of what I'm doing. A young man called and he said, my girlfriend and I love each other very much. We're going to get married. Then he said, we have a terrific, good sexual relationship. Then he said, in order to be on your good side, I want you to know right away we are using what? Contraception. And I already was very happy. They love each other. I certainly like that. They're going to get married. I believe in that. They do have good sex, which means both of them are satisfied. Great. They're responsible. They're using contraception. And I said, because what happened with the program, and this is the same that's happening right now in the newspaper column, it creates a kind of a community of listeners. And with the radio program, I said, what's your comment? Because sometimes people write in or call in to give some advice or a comment to somebody who called in or wrote in before. And he said his girlfriend likes to toss onion rings on his erect penis. And I did what you are doing right now. I laughed because as a good sex therapist, I have to visualize what people do. And then it gave me the opportunity to state my philosophy that anything that two consenting adults do in the privacy of their living room, bedroom, kitchen floor is all right. I luckily had one 3 weeks ago, a man who called, and he said he and his girlfriend have been living together for a year and a half. They now are getting married. He wants to make that night after the wedding ceremony memorable. And for a split second, I was speechless, but I can't afford to be speechless because that time is not permissible on radio. And so I giggled and I kept on talking, hoping that some idea would descend upon me. It did. I said, I'm glad you called. I have an idea when you are in your room by yourself after the wedding ceremony, when you go to the bathroom, come out, don't wear pajamas, only wear a tie and a top hat. And he asked me, where should I put the top hat?
I guess the French fried onion story debunks the myth that sex isn't fattening. Going on to another, I think, more serious observation. I asked my readers prior to coming here what they thought about your column. We had introduced it some months back and had gotten a trickle of a response, but nothing very heavy. In the dozen or so letters I got, most of which were critical, but I expected that, what I saw was a pattern of connecting the column to your television appearances. And I think people tend to react, those who react negatively, react most negatively to television. The idea of sex in a newspaper, sex advice and so on, I think is a solid one, but I question whether the entertainment nature of your show, and in addition to that, your appearances on Johnny Carson and so on, give a certain coloration to your column that may cause editors and newspapers some problems with it.
Let me do some thinking.
Okay.
One split second of thinking. I do understand and I respect what you are saying. I don't think I have a pat answer. The only answer that I would have is that if somebody listens to me carefully, they do know that despite the show business part of it, that there is a solid scientific background. And I only could say, I do understand, I respect what you are saying, I only can say is if maybe, by being on David Letterman, I just won the nationwide Best Speaker of the Year award on college campuses. That certainly stemmed from my appearances on a program like David Letterman, because across the country our youngsters are watching and listening. If I get the message across that sexuality has a certain responsibility, like using contraceptive if they don't want to be parents, then I'm doing a service.
Jim, do you have any feeling about that, about whether newspapers should run columns like Dr. Ruth's or several others similar?
I do have some thoughts on it. I don't believe you can separate Dr. Ruth of television from the Dr. Ruth who writes your newspaper column. I think that no matter how restrained and how conservatively written the newspaper column is, people still associate that column with what they see and hear on television and radio, and so I have some reservations about it. I'd like to make just a couple of comments, if I could, on the whole question of whether newspapers ought to run sex columns like that. You know, my wife and I have always enjoyed coming to these things, seeing America's top editors make brilliant presentations about all kinds of important subjects, and she said, well, maybe some year they'll find a subject you know something about. And I came home and told her I was going to be on a panel about sex, and she said, that's not it. I wonder if we owe our readers sex columns. We help them with shopping tips. We give them cents-off coupons. We help them plan their vacations. If we can help them with good shopping, why not good sex? Well, it just seems to me that it's different, and it's not just Dr. Ruth. We had a run-in a little over a year ago with Parade magazine, as an example, which ran an article called Sex in America. Several papers declined to distribute Parade that week. We did distribute it, but we ran an editor's note somewhere else in the paper advising parents that they might want to review the article before their children read it. We didn't think it was appropriate for the Birmingham News as it was written. We would not have published it by one of our own reporters on our own pages. I wrote to Walter Anderson to complain about the appropriateness of that for general circulation newspapers, and he replied that the survey was scientific, which we never had any doubt about. He argued that great pains had been taken to make sure that it was not salacious or titillating. I told him that I just didn't believe that many American parents were prepared to get up on Sunday morning and discuss anal sex or mouth-to-genital sex or some of the other very specific descriptions of sexual activity in that magazine over the Sunday morning breakfast table. So we did not think it was appropriate for our newspaper. Obviously, we got our message across. 5 months later, there was an article called The Most Intimate Moments, or more specifically, How to Get the Best Out of the Most Intimate Moments, sort of a how-to column for afterplay. So I'm sure that was very sound scientifically also. Dr. Ruth would know more about that probably than I would. Is the Birmingham News or your newspaper the place for that kind of discussion? I say no. You're not dealing with grocery carts. You're not dealing with cents-off coupons. I think it's a subject which needs to be taken seriously, not turned into a dirty joke or the mechanical equivalent of a plumbing manual or something of that sort. There are places where that information is available. We're certainly not keeping anything from our readers. Dr. Ruth is on television, I think, any hour of the day or night, as far as I can tell. She's on the radio. She makes about 103 lectures a week, I think, judging from our newspapers and the television reports. You can even read her in a newspaper in Birmingham, Alabama, as a matter of fact. The other paper in town bought her column after we declined it. So you see, judgments do differ.
Shere, do you have a feeling about that, about newspapers' role in these kinds of columns, or even just general sex education, since it doesn't seem to be happening some other places where it maybe should?
Well, I think that it's clear that we don't want the wrong atmosphere around issues of sexuality, but you certainly can't point a finger at Dr. Westheimer in this sense that the whole atmosphere around sex has been one of titillation. I know myself being written about by feature writers constantly. I run this problem. I mean, I went through 10 years of being interviewed by feature writers. And first of all, being a naive, I was just myself. Then I would read the article and it would describe what I was wearing for the first 3 or 4 columns, and whether or not the writer liked me, it would either be described in a friendly way or a non-friendly way. And then I tried other things. I tried being very severe. That didn't work. Then I tried being more friendly. That didn't work either. So I find when you deal with sex, almost any place it's written about in a newspaper, unless you have some reporter who's used to the topic, you come out with this. I don't know, is it Playboy magazine that created this atmosphere? Where did this atmosphere come about? It would be great if there were a different atmosphere around sexuality.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to the floor for questions now. It's usually members only. Given the subject matter, I think we should allow members and spouses. Please give your name and where you're from, and please don't be embarrassed. There are microphones right out there.
None of this a friend wants to know either. Identify yourself.
I can see a thing with these lines. That's right.
Hi, Nancy Woodhull
Hi,
from
Nancy.
USA Today. I wonder if the editors would comment if they give as much thought to the type of movie ads they run showing sexually explicit poses sometimes, as they do to when they run Parade's magazine's issue on Sex in America. I also love to hear Ms. Hite's response to that, too.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Who wants to go first? Jim?
We don't run X-rated movie ads in our newspaper. The other paper does. Our policy is that we don't want to encourage that industry.
The other paper sounds like more fun in Birmingham, I'll tell you that.
We'll never really know. It has such a small circulation.
Rich?
We run the ads, but the copy on them is pretty well restricted. There's somebody who must be the best editor in the advertising department who rearranges some words and I think some graphics on the submissions from the theaters.
Shere, she asked specifically for your thoughts.
Yes, that's exactly my point. Even better to say that about the movies, and it's not only the X-rated movies, but almost any movie, containing NTV Guide, for example, also explicit kind of implications, and Dynasty and all the ads for all of that, all has the same kind of aura. Sure, it's fun if sex is kind of, dirty or hidden, I guess. I don't know, but that's certainly the implication of all of it. So that there doesn't seem to be any way, there's either clinical or there's that. And it's very hard to figure out, it takes a good reporter to steer a road down the middle. But constantly you see these kinds of ads appearing everywhere.
Yes.
Joanne Albers, Public Opinion, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. There have been columns or local panels answering letters, say a social worker, a doctor, so on. I wonder what you think of that approach in dealing with the subject.
Me?
Yeah,
I certainly, my doctorate from Columbia University is in the interdisciplinary study of the family. And I, if it were feasible, would absolutely agree, but I would also add a theologian. I would, from time to time, I do quite a bit of work with a Catholic priest in pre-Cana counseling. I don't talk about the theology, but I do talk about the sexual aspect of the relationship of a marriage, which in those cases is, of course, after the wedding ceremony. I would welcome that very much. I do believe, and that's why I believe that this kind of morning discussion is very important for me, because I do get some feedback in terms of other disciplines, and if it were feasible to have once a theologian and once a gynecologist. Last night I gave a talk and there was a gynecologist in the audience, and I right away asked him to answer some of those questions, and it certainly broadened the information given. I think it's an excellent idea.
Yes.
Arnold Friedman, Morning Union, Springfield, Massachusetts, one of the editors who runs your column. We took the column with a little trepidation, got a few complaints based primarily on your reputation rather than the column, and didn't get any comment until this past week when you had one particular question about oral sex, which had some response. The thing I'd like to comment on is that it seems to me that your column so far has dealt a lot less with sex than with relationships, and I for one, would rather see it deal more with sex than it has, and will take the flack that comes with it.
Great. I will take that back to New York. With pleasure.
Well, it's... Oh, no. Your name, ma'am?
Cindy Stiff, Tallahassee. Dr. Ruth, given the explicit nature of your TV show and your radio show, how old do you think children should be before they should be allowed or permitted to listen to those shows? And what is your advice to teenagers regarding sexual activity?
My advice to teenagers is to certainly wait until they are mature enough to take the responsibility for sexual activity. And I can't give it an age, because sometimes there might be a 25-year-old who is not mature. But the ones that do decide, not under pressure, but where the decision is made, I certainly believe that it behooves us as society to make protection available. The issue of young people, I do know, my radio program, let's say about the radio, is not for children, and we do have a disclaimer. I know very well that there are 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds who on Sunday nights, nobody has to scream at them, go and take your shower and go to bed, because at 10 o'clock exactly, they are in bed under the cover with earphones on. I would hope that after 3-4 times listening, that they will get bored. Because after all, there is not an infinite variety of questions, and I would hope that they get bored and listen to some music or sports. However, if they listen and what they hear is correct information, and it is certainly more correct and dispels the myth than what they hear from their peers. And the same is true on television. I would think that after a while they might go on to other pursuits, but when they listen, they do hear correct information. And I do hope that they hear the respect for human sexuality, for family life, and for those things that I try to teach. Great question. I do, however, believe that sex education, I once wrote a paper called Sex Education, the Case of the Forgotten Parent. I do not think that sex education ought to be taken over by newspaper editors. I do believe it has to be a combination. Again, like with your question, it has to be a combination of the parents, the schools, the churches, the synagogues, the community centers, the universities, and the mass media. I am not saying that television, radio, and newspapers should take over that function. I believe that what we are doing together is to provide for that combination. Thank you.
Shere Hite?
I'd just like to say something also. You know, I've been collecting data since 1972, and I have thousands of replies from teenagers. They see pornography, if you want to call Playboy and Penthouse or Hustler pornography, from age 5, 6, 7 at their friend's house. There are very few teenagers left who haven't seen it by the time they're 9. So it's very good to have some other kind of information out there counteracting the one-sided view that they'll get from that kind of publication.
Yes.
My name is Walter Lowe, and I'm from the Chicago Daily Defender. There are those who feel that since general interest newspapers publish information on a daily basis regarding murders, rapes, and I say rapes showing that it's not about sex, but it's about violence, and also publish columns by people who espouse notions of racial discrimination, bigotry, of other forms like ageism and sexism, that since this is being done on a regular basis throughout the United States, that why shouldn't there be columns which would positively, wholesomely, and beneficially inform people of all ages, including children, about sex? And I'd just like any of the panelists' opinions on that.
Thank you. Jim?
I think it's entirely possible to, and I understand your question and agree with some of the premise, not all of it. I do think it's possible to write about sexuality and sexually related matters in a very constructive, non-sensationalized way, and I certainly don't advocate we not do that. As to whether a particular column is, as you put it, positive, a wholesome, that's the kind of judgment you make, whether it's a column about sex or politics or whatever. You make your judgments based on your best feeling of what your newspaper is and what you're trying to achieve in your community. So I don't say that you can't do it. Judgments differ, but I do think it is a legitimate area of concern for an editor of a newspaper.
Anyone else?
I thought it was a good point.
Okay, we have come to the end of our hour.
Somebody.
Oh, we've got one more. Okay, last one.
Skip Perez of the Lakeland, Florida Ledger. For Dr. Westheimer and Ms. Hite, what are you telling women these days about the dangers of the pill? What are you telling women these days about the dangers of the pill?
Ruth?
I say it over and over, and I, with many things, don't mind if I sound like a broken record. That I'm not a gynecologist, so I do not discuss the pill or the intrauterine device. I say this is an issue between a gynecologist and a patient. I'm going to be speaking at the orthopharmaceutical to gynecologists, and I'm going to say the same thing, that as an educator, I do talk about the diaphragm and the condom until we in this society will find a better contraceptive, because we do not have a perfect contraceptive. And then I do go into the details of the usage of the condom and the diaphragm. I do, however, when you ask me here in a professional setting like this, I will say to you that there is no question that there are certain dangers. I give you an example. There's no question that there are women who don't know when they are on the pill, to get off the pill, wait 3 months until they get pregnant, and we do know some of those results. But in general, about the hormonal balance or the hormonal household, I do not discuss that because I'm not a medical doctor.
I would not recommend the pill. I was just at a national conference in Colombia in South America, and there was a lot of discussion there about what kind of birth control. Illegal abortion is still the main means of birth control, which causes a lot of deaths among the poor population. The second means is the IUD, which they hadn't understood yet, causes so many complications. And now the big debate there was, should you give a woman general anesthesia to insert an IUD, which of course is inaccurate. You don't need general anesthesia first, and second, an IUD is probably not a good idea. It's true that there is not a very good birth control measure at this time. I certainly wouldn't recommend the birth control pill. It has too many side effects which are unknowable. The problem is, you see, you look at the teenage pregnancy rate, and you constantly hear things like, well, girls should learn to take the birth control pill, or Planned Parenthood had a little button, you can say no. But it's always put on top of the woman that she's the one who's supposed to somehow or another control this whole, we're the moral whatevers of the world. Actually, I think there should be a big campaign to teach boys that becoming a man doesn't mean that you penetrated a girl. That's where the problem is hanging in there, because this Body Human series on television had one of its main series, the ad and TV guide said, the day he became a man, implying that the subject would be sexuality. But penetrating a girl doesn't make you a man. I mean, maybe walking on hot coals or writing a dissertation or something like that. But I really think there's very little said about the stereotypes we give boys of how they should be sexual. There are many options for boys, and they don't have to get it in.
I think that's a good place to end it, isn't it? Thank you.